Медіа-центр Україна Ukrinform продовжує свою роботу.
Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation. Today is August 23, and I want to congratulate everybody with the Day of the Flag of Ukraine. Now, the civil organization OPORA will represent a study about the attitude of Ukrainians to the citizens who remain in the temporarily occupied territories. Our guests today are Anatoliy, Bondarchuk, and Dmytro, Bashtovy, the analysts at civil network OPORA. So, Mr. Anatoliy, can you please tell us who are those remaining in temporarily occupied territories, and what is the attitude of Ukrainians who stay here to those in the temporarily occupied territories? Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us, for watching this broadcast. We at OPORA wanted to study this issue, how the Ukrainians who stay in the territories under Ukrainian control see and perceive the Ukrainians who, due to different circumstances, remain in the temporarily occupied territories. Our sociologic study was going on from 3rd to 17th of July. We've covered 2011 respondents who are in the territory under Ukrainian control from different regions of Ukraine. And the questioning was exercised by personal interview, which is important to mention. And according to the results of our study that we've achieved a number of interesting conclusions, one of which is that Ukrainians who are staying in the Ukrainian controlled territory, they have more understanding to those Ukrainians who still are in occupation, who ended up in occupation under the 24th of February 2022, after the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion. So if we talk about the results, I would like to focus on them to understand, using the figures, what is the dynamics and what are the trends that we were able to observe. If I may ask for the next slide. So the first thing, we've divided the Ukrainians staying in the temporarily occupied territories into three groups: those who reside in Crimea, and those who reside in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and those who ended up in occupation under the 24th of February 2022. So first of all, we were questioning them about who are those people for Ukrainians. So the most popular answer was that the Ukrainians who stay in Crimea for the 9 years, they are the hostages of a difficult circumstances. This is the answer supported by 31% of the respondents. This is the biggest indicator. 16.6% of Ukrainians think that they are the hostages of the occupational forces. So in fact, 50% of Ukrainians think that those who remain in occupation in Crimea, they are the hostages of the citizens, whether life circumstances like personal or family circumstances, or otherwise they are the hostages of the occupational forces. Then 17.7% say that those people are just opportunists, and no matter who governs them. And there is another question, that they are adherents of USSR or Russian world ideology. In the opinion of Ukrainians, they have nostalgia about the Soviet times, and in fact they are passive fans of Russian Federation. And the least popular answer was that those people are the traitors who support the armed aggression against Ukraine. This is the answer supported by 8.4% of Ukrainians. So you see, this answer about the traitors, it's not popular, and in fact it's a very positive trend. and generally we see that the majority of Ukrainians, they mostly support the idea that those people are the hostages, almost 50% against 40% of Ukrainians who think that those people are either traitors or opportunists or passive adherents of the Russian ideology. That's the first tendency. Another tendency is that in fact the biggest support and understanding is enjoyed by those people in Crimea, by the residents of the east, of the north, and of the south. You know, in the west, the Ukrainians have less understanding of those people who remain in Crimea. Talking about the age categories, there are certain tendencies observed too. We see from the slides that the younger are the Ukrainians, the less they understand those who remain in Crimea. This is what we see according to the results of our question. The 32% of those above 60, they understand those who remain in Crimea, and the same for the age category from 45 to 54 years, and 31.7% of the respondents aged 30 to 44 years, and this position is only shared by 25.9% of the Ukrainians aged 18-29. And I think that it can be explained by the fact that those people who are younger, they are more mobile and they find it easier to move to a new location, to start a new life in the Ukrainian controlled territories. So talking about the language aspect, we've studied this aspect too, and we see that there are certain differences. There are people who use either or those who use Russian and Ukrainian at the same time, and those who use Russian in their everyday life, they demonstrate more understanding to those who remain in Crimea. And we see that 39.1% of the Ukrainians who speak Ukrainian and Russian, they share the same opinion. 36% of those speak in Russian and 26.6% of those using Ukrainian, they share this opinion. So basically there is a difference, but I cannot say that it's critical. In the proceeding to the topic of occupied Donbass, the territories occupied since 2014-2015, the tendencies are similar with those for Crimea. However, a larger percentage of Ukrainians demonstrate understanding to the people who remain in those territories. Talking about percentage again, the opinion that those people are the hostages of the difficult life circumstances is supported by 39.5% of Ukrainians. Then second is that those people are opportunists, no matter who governs them, only is supported by 16%, hostages of the occupational forces 14.5%, and passive adherents of the Russian and USSR ideologies 14.3%. But again, this tendency, there is a tendency that the least percentage of people see the people from Donbass as the traitors. As to the regional distribution, we see the similar some tendencies which are similar to those that we were observing in the situation with the Crimea. So in the south and east, people demonstrate most understanding to those who who remain in Donbass, and this indicator is smaller in the center and in the west of the country. So talking about center, it's 34%, and for the west is 27.1%. However, in the east we see 42%, and in the south 48.1%. And another interesting tendency is that in the west, respectively, bigger number of people think that those who remain in the occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions are traitors, but this percentage is not so big too. Only 10.8% of Ukrainians from the west think so, 4.2% from the south, and 3.4% from the east. So basically, the percentage is low. However, there is certain difference, and talking about the age distribution, there are some differences as well. We see that the younger generations of Ukrainians, they, so to say, perceive more critically those who remained in the occupied territories, those who did not leave. 33.1% of Ukrainians aged 18 to 29, they think that those people who remain in the temporarily occupied territories are the hostages of their family or life circumstances. Then 33.8% of those 45-59 years, and then those 60 plus years are 37.1%, and 39.1% of those aged 30-45 years. Then we've made a comparison by the language, and the tendency with Crimea is repeating itself. So those Ukrainians who use Russian or Ukrainian and Russian languages in their everyday lives, they demonstrate more understanding and more support to those who remain in the temporarily occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk region. So talking about the answer that they are the hostages of the difficult life circumstances, this version is supported by 42.5% of those who use Ukrainian and Russian, and 29.9% of those using Ukrainian language. And this answer, the traitors who support the armed aggression, the percentage of those who speak Russian is 4.4%, and 8.8% of those who use Ukrainians, and 7.1% is the average indicator. So basically a very small number of Ukrainians think so. And then let's proceed to the tendencies that we were able to observe in those territories that were occupied by Russia after the 24th of February 2022. So we will be talking about the newly occupied territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. So in fact, we see cardinal tendencies. There more and more Ukrainians think that generally 44.4% think that people who remain in the newly occupied territories are the hostages of difficult life circumstances. 31.9% says that they are the hostages of the occupational forces. Only 6.7% support the version that they are the opportunists no matter who governs them, and 3.6% of Ukrainians think that they are the passive adherents of the Russian ideology, and 2.9% think that those people are the traitors who support the armed aggression of Russia. So we see those answers who say that those people are either opportunists or traitors or passive adherents are supported only by 13% of respondents against almost 80% of Ukrainians who say that those people are the hostages of difficult life conditions or occupational forces, those who, for example, don't allow them to leave those territories and stuff like that. Talking about the age distribution, we were not observing any such tendency. Ukrainians of all the age categories, they perceive in the same way those Ukrainians who remain in occupation. There is a difference, but it's not as critical as in previous cases. Talking about the language issue and the language of communication, we see there is some difference here, but again, it's not so significant. In fact, those Ukrainians who use both Ukrainian and Russian, it's 50%, they think that those people are the hostages of difficult life conditions. And talking about the traitors, who thinks that those people are the traitors, only 3.4% of those speaking Ukrainians, 2.3% of those using Russian, and 2.2% of those speaking both Ukrainian and Russian. So talking about the summaries and conclusions, we see that half of the Ukrainians perceive those in occupation and those who live in occupation for more than 9 years, they perceive them with understanding, and also 80% of Ukrainians support those who remain in occupation after the 24th of February 2022. We see that the center and west perceive those people more critically, but generally the east and the south, they demonstrate more understanding to those people remaining in occupation. Also, there are some differences by the language of communication. Those using Ukrainians, they demonstrate more criticism to those people, and we also observe a tendency that the younger Ukrainians, they demonstrate more criticism to those people remaining in occupation. So talking about the conceptual reasons why it happens so, I would like to segregate. This is my researcher's opinion. I think that the time of occupation doesn't matter for the people who remain there. It influences the trust of those who are not in occupation to those who remain in occupation, and the longer they spend in occupation, the lower is the level of trust to them, because they are forced to communicate with the occupiers more frequently. They are forced to live by the rules set by the occupational administrations, communicate more with them, live in those conditions, and people respectively think that due to that, the trust to those people may be reducing. Also, there is a problem that is significant in my opinion. I think not all of the Ukrainians understand quite well what are the circumstances that the people in occupation live in. We know that there are a lot of cases of pressure on the people with pro-Ukrainian position. People are being abducted, kidnapped. There were cases when, for example, the mayor of Kherson has disappeared and we don't know about his fate. It's not only about the activists, but also the representatives of the local governments, just the people who stand on pro-Ukrainian positions, people who refuse to accept Russian passports, express their identity in one way or another. So in fact, people who stay there, they are under very serious pressure by the occupational forces, who want to the maximum extent integrate those territories into their economic and political space. We have to understand it, and we have to understand that people are in very difficult circumstances there, both social and economic, because they need to somehow survive in those conditions, to work somehow, to feed their families and stuff like that. That's another aspect. And yet another important component, in my opinion, is that there is a myth which is very frequently disseminated, that those who remain in the occupied territories, they support the occupational administrations. In my opinion, it's not so. It was demonstrated by the questioning back in 2014 when we talk about Donbass. The most of the people there were supporting Ukraine. They were sharing the same views. There were big meetings in support of Ukraine, and there is certain percentage of those who support Russia, but it's a very small percentage of people. Another aspect to be reckoned with is the structure of the population in the occupied territories. We have to understand that many Ukrainians left not only the Ukrainian controlled territories to move to the safer areas or left abroad, but it's also about the people who stay in the occupied territories. Many people also left from there. Many Ukrainians, different Ukrainians, due to a number of reasons, they decided to leave, and it's an important thing that should be reckoned with. For example, there are such opinions being spread that this or that city is pro-Russian. Well, it's not quite so, because the majority of people with the pro-Ukrainian position could live there. Here I would like to give the floor to Dmytro, who can tell you in more detail about the attitude of Ukrainians to passportization, to those who are supposed to be brought to criminal liability for collaboration with the occupiers, and the things alike. Thank you. I would like to add to what Anatoliy has said about the attitude of Ukrainians to those Ukrainians who remain in the temporarily occupied territories. You know, Russia tries to change the ethnic structure. They have a policy of populating those areas with other peoples of Russia. They make exemptions on mortgages. They russify those territories. We have to understand that those areas are repopulated not only by Ukrainians. So the understanding of sociology from inside of the occupied territories may have some errors or be considered void, but in our other study that we had with Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, we wanted to study understanding of our Ukrainians living in the territories under Ukrainian control, their attitude towards Ukrainians who accept their Russian passports, their understanding and attitude about who is subject to the criminal liability for collaboration with the occupational government or for other actions, or just we can try to identify the categories of population who are supposed to be brought to liability. And we also need to understand what is the attitude of Ukrainians to the postponement of elections in the temporarily occupied territories after their liberations, and can the voting rights of those citizens in temporarily occupied territories be restricted. So the attitude of people there is very important, because after the deoccupation of the territories we will have to face a problem of looking for the ways to reduce the social pressure, to revert to full-fledged cultural, political and social life. And in our opinion, we should start working with it today. This is why we've segregated those issues that I've named, and I will proceed to them right away. I will just add a little bit about the sociology itself. More than 2,000 people were questioned, above 18 years, and they were residing in the Ukrainian controlled territory until the 24th of February, and those people who were residing in the territories occupied since years 2014-2015 were not added to this questioning, and the error is below 2.5%. So talking about passportization, I would like to say that it's one of the important aspects of integration of temporarily occupied territories to the space of Russian Federation, it can be named one of the elements of genocide of Ukrainian people. It's expressed by the fact that without Russian passport you cannot survive in that territory. Our citizens are deprived of their rights to medical services, government services, and it negatively affects the very fact of existence in those territories. In the same way, the occupational forces, they try to find ways to press on the Ukrainians who support the Ukrainian government and to find the people that they call zhdeny for their deportation. And I cannot help but remember the last case when in Kherson region they were directly stating that if people refuse to accept passports, they wouldn't be able to get insulin in Lazurny Kherson region, and occupational forces threatened to deport those children and their parents and children who refuse to study in compliance with Russian education programs. So one of our studies was passportization. So people perceive those accepting Russian passports with understanding. 66 or 76% they think that the people accept those passports under physical threat or due to some financial reasons to be able to continue getting their salaries or pensions. 36% of respondents support this opinion, and only 31.7% support the idea that the Ukrainians accept Russian passports because they support Russia, or for resistance tasks. This is the opinion supported by 14% of our respondents. So the 14% say that there is a resistant movement. We understand those who support the Ukrainian government in force to repel the enemy, to report the movement of enemy troops and stuff like this. So the only thing I can summarize is the information policy of this passportization is at the decent level. Ukrainians understand that other Ukrainians in temporarily occupied territories, they need to survive and to accept Russian passports as a consequence. But after the liberation, during reintegration of those territories, the matter of justice is still very important. I know that our government considers different ways of implementation of those steps. We know that there is a working group with the Ministry of Reintegration to identify the problematic issues of operation of the local governments and other economic entities in occupied territories. There are special laws being developed to identify the list of measures that can be viewed as collaboration, which is very important because we have to approach the solution of this issue in complex. And in this aspect, we've decided to ask specific people, our citizens, what do they think, what are the activities, what are the categories of the people who are supposed to be brought to liability in front of the law. So, as you can see, the representatives of the law enforcement agencies, 95% who switched sides, 95% of respondents think that they should be brought to liability. 92.8% think that those who supported the referendums and were collaborating with the occupational governments. A little bit lesser percentage think that those who were nominated in the elections for the occupational government offices, that they should be brought to liability. So those are the categories of the people who are perceived most critically by our citizens. You know, there is a mutation of the election process in the temporarily occupied territories. Now they organize or some political promotion of the political parties, and I would like to recommend to avoid any participation in this elections process, let alone supporting its organization if it's possible due to physical reasons. I understand, we all understand how they can hold the elections under pressure. More than 60% of our respondents think that those should be brought to criminal liability who were voting at the referendums and elections. In the same way, 59.1% think that those should be brought to liability among the local businessmen if they preserved the jobs but they were paying taxes to the occupational administration. 53% think that the teachers who started teaching children under the Russian education program should be brought to liability, and our people are the most tolerant to those who were providing medical services under Russian standards. Only 21.7% think so. The pensioners who submitted their documents to receive the Russian social payments, 27.4%. And the representatives of the utility companies who supported the operation of critical infrastructure, 33.9%, and 34.5% of respondents think that those should be brought to liability who received Russian passports. So basically, I would like to reiterate once again that all the law enforcement agencies, the imitation of political life and integration through the elections is a very important and critical for perception by our citizens. And here I think that the attitude will be very critical to them after the occupation, so they should pay attention to it. After the deoccupation, we may state that there will be a lot of challenges in the elections process. There will be full-fledged migration processes, but a very important issue will be still the elections in the occupied territories. And here we've decided to ask our citizens what is their opinion on restriction of the election rights, whether to be nominated or to vote. And as we can see, we've identified that the voting rights should be restricted for those who was working with the law enforcement agencies or occupational authorities. The percentage of those who support this opinion is 18.3%. Lesser percentage supports restriction for those who were organizing the elections and referendums or taking part in them, 16.1%. For those who were accepting Russian passports, only 3.1% of our citizens think that those people should be restricted in their voting rights, but totally 61% of our respondents think that their voting rights should be restricted for all the categories that were mentioned above. So those who were hesitating or are categorically against restriction of the voting rights of our citizens are not so numerous, only 7.4%. But I want to reiterate it again, it's not about deprivation of voting rights, but about their restriction. And I would like to proceed to the next two questions, restrictions and postponement of the elections. Here we've segregated the territories occupied in years 14-15 and those occupied after the 24th of February 2022. And I would like to mention that, well, as you can see from the slide, the majority of the citizens, more than 68%, think that we should postpone the elections in occupied regions of Donetsk and Luhansk region, as well as Crimea. And talking about the period, 24.5% say that the election should be postponed 1 year, 7.2% think that it should be 1 to 5 years, and 12% think that it should be more than or up to 10 years. And there is a certain percentage who say that the election should not be held there. And to compare it with the territories that were occupied after the 24th of February, the difference is that more people think that the election should not be postponed there. 37.3% of the citizens, they think that no such period of postponement is required for the organization of the election process. And the biggest difference is that 27.4% think that the election should be postponed for 1 year only. So if we compare occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk region plus Crimea, more people think so. And here in this case it's only 1 year. So the option with 1 to 5 years is quite popular because 21% think that this is the period the election should be postponed for 5 to 10 years. I apologize, 5 to 10 years it's 7.3%, and more than 10 years only 2.3%. So you see the most popular periods are those shorter ones, like 1 year or from 1 to 5 years. And here I agree with Anatoliy. I would like to repeat that duration of occupation, as we see, directly influences the understanding of when the elections should be held. The process of reintegration, return of Ukrainian control may be extended for some period, as we know, to return the authorities to the occupied Crimea. The government says they need 50,000 employees, and they're building the talent pool to work in the local governments, in the utility services, educational sector, medical sector, to bring that life back quickly. But it's difficult not to agree with the opinion of our people, because renewal without renewal of full-fledged public governance in the occupied territories, from the point of view of organization, elections there would be just impossible. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Dear colleagues, do you have any questions to our speakers? My question is about the elections to be postponed in the temporarily occupied territories after their liberation. How can we build trust in the election process among the residents of the temporarily occupied territories, given they will be intimidated and they will be frightened by their experience? You know, even if we have elections after a year, how we can still build trust with them? I think that the trust will return through understanding of the stabilization process, stabilization measures to be taken in my opinion, after the justice is brought back to the temporarily occupied territories, as the election process would be organized through understanding, so to say, and clear organization. I think people will have more trust in the process itself. Because obviously if we come there and say, come on, let's vote, it's just impossible Right away, we've said that it's mostly about well-adjusted policy. So this is why the election process should be postponed. We first need to reintegrate those people to our political life, and at the same time, if we go step by step, if we implement it gradually, we will have the trust returning gradually to the election process. I don't personally think that after the occupation there will be a complete distrust to the election process, because let's be honest, even in the territories under Ukrainian control, the elections cannot happen right away. So the trust is needed to the political system. It should be representative. There should be understanding what to do with the people who left abroad, how to get them involved in the election process. So I think that if there is a systemic work by the government, by the civil sector, by us, this is when we can start talking about return of the trust to the election process in the temporarily occupied territories. There will be a question from the foreign journalists. There is a simultaneous translation going on, so you can use the earpiece.
Can I?
Yeah.
So, good morning. My name is Lorenzo Cremonesi for the Italian daily Corriere della Sera from Milano. I have 3 questions. Number one, I know it's complicated, but do you have any idea how many people are you talking of in the 3 territories? No, that's a question that we foreign journalists always ask to everybody. I was now in Kharkiv, and there is a kind of an absorption center for people who are still coming through a kind of a green corridor near Sumy. They're coming out. So my question, like the question of my colleagues, first of all, if we take the 3 territory, can we tell us an idea how many Ukrainians are there in Crimea? I mean, original Crimea, Donbass, and the 2022 invasion areas. No. Second, how many Russian were moved? We always hear about this idea, that Putin is moving people from Russia to the territories. So can you give us an idea, especially, of course, in Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea, these 3 territories, how many people came, which we think that if there will be the occupation, of course, these people will leave. But how many are they? And 3, which is maybe interest of you for your research. Some of the people I met now in Kharkiv, they told me that they left because there was a draft at the next year. This depends on the area. In some area, they should be already in September. Some in August. But they left when they were obliged to enter in the military service. So the men left. They tried to come here. They tried to escape. So this category is not here. So what will be the attitude of the Ukrainian to people who served in the Russian army or in the Tur militia in this period? Those are 3 questions. Thank you.
Да. Давайте спробуємо відповісти на всі питання.
Okay, I see. Let me try to answer all those questions one by one. Regarding your first question, unfortunately, I don't have figures which would tell us what is the number of Ukrainians staying in those regions. In my opinion, it's a couple of millions. That's my personal opinion. I think that it's about 4 to 5 million people. This is my personal assumption. This is a big number of Ukrainians. We know that now from 6 to 8 million Ukrainians are abroad.
You say 2 million people who stayed.
No, I think maybe 4 or 5 billion people there. But I don't know. It's only my opinion. It's Yeah. But it's my opinion. I don't have any data for. Да.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have in our organization does not have the exact figures. But my personal assumption is that it's several million people. Talking about the Russians who currently live in the occupied territories, it's a complicated question too. I don't know. I think it's probably tens of thousands, maybe more. We were preparing the materials on Mariupol that many Russians are coming there, so there were more than a couple of tens of thousands of Russians coming there. Maybe this number is bigger for Donetsk and Lugansk. I don't have again the exact figures, but I assume this number may come up to maybe hundreds of thousands Russians, and the longer the occupation goes on, the more Russians will be coming there, because Dmytro has already mentioned there is the special mortgage program for Russians. Russia has plans to do developing in Mariupol to move the Russians there. Also, there is a number of Russians who reside in Crimea, so I think that it will be a challenge for our state what to do with those people. It's a complex question that we have to think about very seriously what to do with them. Now, it's difficult to answer this question for me. So it was 2 questions, and the third one.
Ті, хто служили в російській армії, так? Чи про наших солдат?
Or about no, for what I understand, those who were drafted to...
Two different of people, well, that we know. There are people who volunteer since 2014. These people fighting with this militia pro-Russian. But there are now, and of course, I assume these people would leave. They wouldn't stay. But there are Ukrainians who are now under draft, you know. That's a major problem. Everybody talk about that. When you go to when you talk with people who leave the territory, there are now new internal regulation law who are in different places according different municipality. I didn't find a common pattern. Kherson is different from Donbass, etc. But for instance, there was a guy who left Lugansk. I was talking with him a few days ago in Kharkiv, and he told me that in Lugansk, from beginning of August, he was supposed to enter in the Russian army with the local fighters, and he left. So, but another family from near Mariupol told me they left because the father was supposed to enter before the end of the year. I mean, before 31st of December, he was supposed to become a soldier with the Russian fighters. So, what to do with these people?
Well, you're asking very good but very difficult questions. I believe that we should create a complex approach to those people who were committing crimes, who were committing war crimes. These people should be brought to liability according to the law of Ukraine if they were involved in any criminal activities. As to the people who were mobilized in a forced manner, but they have not committed any crimes, I think we should develop some approach for them how to deal with them. there should be some different kind of liability, maybe some more liberal liability contemplated for them. For sure, there is a problem of forced mobilization in the occupied territories. We know about that. There is a lot of information about that, and we urge the people to the maximum extent possible to avoid, if they can, obviously, this forced mobilization to the Russian armed forces, or, like you mentioned, to leave those territories if they have such an opportunity, or otherwise avoid by any means to be mobilized to the occupational forces. And again, we see that the Russian passports that Russia tries to disseminate very actively, by taking that passport, a person in fact risks to be mobilized to the armed forces of the enemy. So those things are related. Maybe Dmytro may add something. Well, from the point of view of forced mobilization, it's a really complicated question. We may draw a line and say that the Russian Federation has committed a lot of evils, and it's very difficult to find a solution how to deal with all those evils. But we know that the Center for National Resistance was informing that in occupied Gorlivka more than 20,000 of our mobilized citizens died in this war, and the occupational government wants to continue this mobilization. There is a social tension growing there because nobody really wants to die. Those facts are confirmed by the data from the National Resistance Center. But I agree with Anatoliy, they should try to avoid mobilization. And another thing is, if they get mobilized, I know it's difficult, but to give up, to be taken prisoner of war. And if people try to, or if they join the armed forces because they want to kill Ukrainians because they support Russia, well, we can do nothing about it. It's a crime. You see, there is a non-tolerance by our citizens to such phenomena. And talking about your second question, studying this matter of integration of occupied territories by Russia into their economic and political space, a lot of things are done for demonstration of such an intense care of the occupied territories, to demonstrate the success of the special military operation in Ukraine and in the occupied part of it. There are many people who are Russians, who are Russian citizens, but they build something there. They build roads, the Ministry of Defense is getting involved, they make new pipelines. There is a lot of construction workers who build or rebuild Mariupol, or they act as if they rebuild something. So to say that it's a static number of Russians in the occupied territories, it would be wrong. They try to change the ethnic composition using the style of Soviet Union crimes. And I would like to wrap up that the difficult question is what to do with them after the occupation, but by the comments of the officials of our government, it's just deportation. Nobody is going to do something with them. There will be no physical execution or something like that. Thank you. I want to thank our guests for the presentation of this study. I'm reminding you visiting us were the analysts of the civil network OPORA, and they presented a study about the attitude of the Ukrainians to the citizens remaining in the temporarily occupied territories. Well, I would like to emphasize that in our answers we represented our personal opinions, but in our website you can see the figures, the presentations, and you can get more information from there. Thank you very much. Thank you, and I want to congratulate everybody with the upcoming Independence Day. Please don't ignore the air raid alert, and thank the security and defense forces who defend our independence with the arms in their hands. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Thank you once again.